like literally the world has changed, but yet we still, for all intents and purposes, teach pilots to fly airplanes the way we did literally 70 years ago. There hasn't been a whole lot of change. So, and I think we do need to make some very significant changes in the way we approach the whole issue, because we're simply going to run out of pilots because it's getting way too expensive to train people.
Welcome back to Ascend Legal 101. I'm Ramona, and today I'm speaking with Mike Doiron, who has been involved in many aspects of aviation for 50 years. Mike started as a dispatcher and progressed to chief flight instructor and chief pilot of the Moncton Flying Club. Mike spent 19 years with Transport Canada, where he held various positions, including Superintendent of Flight Training, Regional Director of System Safety, and National Director of Aviation Safety Promotions. In 1998, he left the government to take the helm of the Moncton Flight College as CEO and principal. He held that position for 12 years until leaving in July 2010 to start Doiron Aviation Consulting, which he still operates today, working with aviation clients across the globe. He has held the position of Senior Vice President of Safety Management Systems for Strategic Aerospace International Limited and is currently the Atlantic Canada Regional Representative of the Canadian Council of Aviation and Aerospace. Please help me welcome Mike Doiron.
Welcome back to Ascend Legal 101. Today I'm joined by Mike Doiron, who is quite frankly a superstar. His CV is far too long for me to go into right now, so I just really like you to meet Mike.
I'm very happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Mike, even though, I've done a bit of an introduction that people will have seen before we started, can you tell me a little bit about your background?
Well, I guess I could sum it up by saying cockpits and classrooms. That's sort of where I've been for the last 50 years. I started off as a young air cadet, got my wings and whatever with the air cadet program. Got hired on as the old Moncton Flying Club's first official dispatcher. Worked at that for a couple of years, got my commercial, worked my way up through being an instructor, chief of the IFR, and then finally the CFI. Hired by Transport, spent 20 years at Transport Canada. Basically had the opportunity to actually work in a bunch of different divisions. But I really, the majority of my time at Transport was first of all, in the flight training world. Did about 6 years there, and then I did 12 years in the system safety group. In 98, when Transport Canada split up and Nav Canada went on its own way, there was a major reshuffling within TC. And I decided that maybe it was time for me to look to do something else, because I really, to be honest with you, I really wasn't happy with the direction I was seeing Transport Canada take it in the future. So I got an opportunity to go out to the Moncton Flight College, and I spent 12 years there as the CEO and principal. Was able to actually take a lot of the lessons learned when I was at Transport and actually put them to work, and discovered some of them work and some of them don't. And based on that experience, when I retired in 2010, people started phoning me up and saying, hey, how would you like to help us with this, that, and the other thing? And here I am 12 years later, busier than I've ever been, helping different operators out and doing a lot of teaching on behalf of Canadian Council for Aviation Aerospace and a bunch of other companies that I work with. So having a ball, to be honest with you.
Good. And I'm really interested to know what the difference between Transport Canada is now and how it was when you worked with them.
Well, the thing is I guess we have to remember that Transport Canada has a sole function, and that is to regulate and establish the standards that are to be used by industry in order to keep the traveling public safe. Okay, so that's non-questionable. Historically, transport worked on the premise that under the Aeronautics Act, the minister had certain responsibilities. And one of them, of course, was to do that regulation job, which is a critical job. I firmly believe in that portion of it. But there was a lot of support and the enhancement of aeronautics and so forth. And I found that in 98, and there was reasons for it, valid reasons, I must say, but the shift that came into play was primarily because of really a restructuring of resources. And there's only, let's face it, there's only so many people to go around, so many jobs to do. And what I found was a shift away from transport being sort of regulator and support, if you will, sort of provide guidance. When I think of, like, for example, the old Regional Aviation Safety Officer program back in the 80s and 90s, that was a very popular program where the RASOs went out and did safety presentations across the country. That doesn't really happen much anymore. Sometimes the inspectors will go out, but it'll usually be a special event. But back then it was the norm. Like, we used to go to flying clubs, flying associations, meetings, and do safety briefings and work with pilots and work with companies and so forth. That doesn't exist anymore, right? And that was the part that I felt, although yes, the regulatory part is the more important part, that's a very critical aspect of maintaining a high level of safety within the system. And unfortunately, I saw that disappearing. So one of the reasons I left. So, but that's the real big difference now, is that piece is no longer there, at least to the level that it was. All right. It's sort of there, but really not.
Right. So I have the same sort of belief, and that the more you educate, the less you have to regulate, because people are no longer ignorant of the regulations or the standard, right?
Mm-hmm.
People can set a higher standard if they are aware.
Yep.
So plus I sue the government for a living, and so in my legal life, I like to see representatives of the Crown represent the Crown in the way they're supposed to. So I'm really also really interested to know if you have any concerns about the industry. I mean, you do a lot of safety training, you help people set up safety management systems and quality management systems. What's your biggest concern about the industry right now?
My biggest concern right now is, in many ways, two levels really. One is the how rapidly the industry is changing, and things are happening very, very quickly. I mean, that's just happening right across our entire spectrum of activities in our lives. I mean, if we just look at technology, it's the big driving factor in many ways. And one of my big concerns is, and this goes everywhere from, in some cases, the companies themselves, but in more specifically, for example, in the world of flying the airplanes, in the world of being a pilot, is automation is becoming a very, very, very big piece of the pie. And I guess my biggest concern is we really haven't taken the time as an industry, not just, Canada, not just transport, but industry worldwide, to seriously look at how we need to modify how we train our pilots so that, first of all, they are still pilots. In other words, they can still fly the airplane. They are still competent, current, and capable to fly the airplane and get it out of a mess. All right. But the other side of the coin is to also be very proficient with the technology. And unfortunately, I don't see that we've done as an industry as a whole, done a really good job of making that transition. Because, for example, if I was to provide you with the flight training manual from 1960, all right, which is a tiny little book about yay big, and it's about that thick, what you would quickly discover are things like the exercise numbers really haven't changed a whole lot. and how we teach those specific exercises haven't changed a whole lot. Well, yes, we could argue, well, gee, Mike, airplanes still fly the same way they always did. Absolutely correct. But here's where the problem comes in. Although we've learned an incredible amount of lessons, in some cases, we haven't done a very good job of adapting to those lessons. All right. So yes, we don't want to forget the way we did it. We want to learn from that. We want to use that as sort of the foundation, but we have to modify it. Like, we have to take into account that the world has changed. I mean, those particular methods of teaching pilots were developed when we were talking on party lines and telephones where you held it up to your ear, and like the 1930s gangsters. All right. Today we have smartphones, whole different world. But yet the way we still teach those specific exercises in many ways hasn't really changed the whole lot. All right. So, and the other thing is, because people sometimes look at those and they say, well, gee, that's the old way of doing business. Now, the changes they've made have been to introduce the automation. Mm-hmm. They haven't really focused back to the traditional, literally hands and feet. All right. And that's my biggest concern, is the pilots of today, in many ways. Now, not all of them. Now, there's a lot of schools that have really stuck to the basic principles of, you got to learn how to fly the airplane first before we teach all the bells and whistles. But unfortunately, the industry as a whole has been shifting towards this. Well, as long as they know how to do the GPS thing, like, here's a bit of a to let you know where my mindset is. I still firmly believe we should be teaching triangle velocities when we teach navigation. All right. Even before we give them an E6B. Well, a lot of young pilots today don't even know what that is, let alone what an E6B is. That what they know is a little calculator on their iPhone that they punch a bunch of numbers. Now, here's the problem with that. When I was teaching someone how to do navigation 45 plus years ago, we would start by teaching them triangle velocities. Now, why did we do that? All right. Well, because we wanted to make sure that they could picture the effect the wind was having on them in the airplane. Because if you draw it out, people tend to understand visuals and they see that. So if I understand that if I'm heading into a headwind, I'm actually going to be going slower. And if I understand that if I'm flying in this direction and the wind is from the right, I'm going to have to correct my heading to the right so I don't drift off course. Well, by simply plugging numbers into a little calculator, you don't get to picture that. And where that really came to roost for me was when I was at the flight college, and I would sit there and do the occasional bit of monitoring, and I would see students plug in these numbers, and they would sort of come up with a heading, and the heading was off by 30, 40. I've seen in some cases they were actually 180 degrees out of whack, because they couldn't picture what they were, and they would look at it and they were more than happy to go flying with that heading. And then you stop and say, hold it now, what's wrong with that? Well, how did you get that? Well, I put the numbers in. And what they didn't realize is they had put the wrong, garbage in, garbage out, right? Right. So they put the wrong numbers in. So they ended up with a scenario, but that was completely off the mark. But the problem is they couldn't sit there and say, boy, that doesn't look right. We couldn't do that because they couldn't picture it, right? And to me, that's just one simple example of how when we get, although we haven't, that 1960s type of training needs to evolve, it can't be forgotten, because that is still the absolute basis of how we should be teaching our pilots. So, the other thing too is just simple energy management. All right. In other words, being able to fly the airplane and knowing literally what the airplane is going to do, how it's going to get, and so forth. In the last month alone, I have seen at least 3 accidents in North America that, and this is just based on photographs that I've seen and so forth. But I'm looking at these accidents and I'm saying they had this great big piece of real estate to land on. Yet they lost control of the airplane just before touchdown and crashed, and people died. All right. And I'm sitting there saying, what happened? Obviously, they stalled prior to getting close to the ground.
Mhm.
But yet they had all kinds of real estate on which to land in. So my question now becomes, what were they doing in those last few minutes? And one of them actually was videotaped from inside the cockpit, and you can see what's going on. The pilot is trying to literally milk the airplane for everything it's got, and eventually stalls the airplane, and the airplane crashes. Fortunately, nobody died, but out of the 8 people on that airplane, I think it was 8 people, 2 of them were very seriously injured. All right. There's no reason for it that I could see, because when you look at the real estate in front of them where they were landing, so what you bash up the airplane? So what you rip off the gear? At least people are going to walk out of this thing in one piece. All right. And so once again, that comes back to basic pilot training, understanding literally the stick and rudder skills that we need as aviators. I don't find her being stressed all that much anymore. You know, to put it in perspective, I might be pontificating a bit here, but I'm a big believer in stick and rudder skills for pilots. Okay. When I started at the flight college, one of the things I introduced was upset training at the commercial pilot level, so that anybody who did an integrated commercial course at MFC for a period of about 8-9 years until I retired, you had to do, as part of your training, 3 hours of upset training in our Citabria and decathlon. Later on, we had a decathlon. Well, the reason that I sort of put that into play was I've always lived by the basic concept that the first time you're upside down in an airplane, you should not have 200 screaming passengers in the back. All right. That's a no-no. That you should not go there. Okay. And that happens. All right. I know a lot of pilots that I've flown with over the years who've never been upside down in an airplane. All right. Well, what happens if they inadvertently, I know for a fact they're never going to do it on purpose because they're scared to death of being upside down in an airplane. So they're not going to do it on purpose, but you know, wake turbulence, it could be severe turbulence, it could be distraction in the cockpit. They allow the airplane to stall, whatever. But people can find themselves in a very aggravated attitude in the airplane, approaching, you know, total inverted flight. Well, they need to know what to do to get out of that. All right. And it's really not complicated. It's so what we did is we would take young pilots working under commercial and put them upside down. All right. We teach them how to roll, how to loop, how to basically, you know, understand the entire envelope of the airplane. It was basic. Don't get me wrong. Like, they sure as heck couldn't go out and fly an air show. I guarantee you that much. But at least if they ever did find themselves in that situation, 2 things. They've been there before, and they should know what to do, or at least have a pretty good idea what to do. And we would literally harp on, here's what you do. And remember, this is what you don't do. All right. Because this will kill you. All right. So all that to basically make sure that they had good hands and feet. And so, yeah, I'm a very, very big believer that although the automation is there in the cockpits today, you know, look at the type of accidents that we've been having as an industry, and loss of control has now become one of the big ticket items. It used to be control flight into terrain. All right. That was a big one. No question. So what do? We did a lot of work on that. A lot of programs have been changed and so forth, and CFIT accidents for the most part have gone downhill. But the other side of the coin is something else has taken over. All right. And it's loss of control. And to me, it's absolutely abhorrent that a person at the airline level, or, you know, charter pilot, commercial pilot level, should physically lose control of that flight, that airplane during flight maneuvering. I just can't come to grips with that whatsoever.
So because a lot of our new pilots are, just sort of summarizing what you just said, they're learning to rely on technology instead of relying on their own feel for the airplane.
Mm-hmm.
how do we fix that? I mean, you may have just answered that already, but if this was your school today and you were training the pilots, what would you do? How would you fix that? Remove the technology in the flight planning and how would you do that?
Now you're going to be shaking your head over this one, but I think we need to use technology to teach how to not use technology, if you get my drift.
Right.
And what I mean by that, let's look at, for example, one of the movements in the world of flight training that started about, probably 15 years ago, give or take, is the whole concept of multi-crew pilot licenses. And to me, that's a major step in the right direction. It's not the full answer, but at least we're heading in the right direction, all right? But if you analyze the MPL training programs, what you will rapidly discover is that you could almost break down the training into two major categories: the physical act of flying the airplane versus managing the flight, i.e. taking care of the automation, the flight planning, and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. And they've literally, although it's not a clear definition, differentiation, they have sort of segregated them a little bit. So here's what happens. With a multi-crew license, for example, when we did that program in Moncton in association with CAE, which I thought was an incredible program. CAE really, I mean, they blew my socks off when I seen this particular program. I was more than happy to join forces with them and provide them with some basic, provide the basic training element for them. But here's the thing. What they did, and you'll see this sort of repeated in a lot of the other multi-crew programs, is when that student graduates from that license, all right, they don't do a private, they don't do a commercial. It's a multi-crew pilot license. Mm. And there's certain very strict limitations. But here's the kicker. The focus of that license is to train them to a specific airline type, i.e., when we were training the students, although we didn't do that portion of it, the goal was that these students would start about 16 months after they arrived at the flight college to begin their training as a first officer on an A320. All right? That's a pretty tall order.
Yeah.
But here's the kicker. They actually only had, when you looked at their logbook at the end of that training package, they actually only had about 80 to 100 hours of actual airplane flying. Right? And a lot of people look at that and say, whoa, man, that's crazy. But no, it's not, because here's what it was. That training was specifically focused on hands and feet. The capability of flying the airplane, managing the airplane, being really good at flying the actual aircraft. Then they transitioned to the intermediate and advanced, which was all flight simulator. And it was either a level 5 or above flight training device or a level D full flight simulator. Well, what does that mean? That means really high-end technology, okay? So a level, in the flight training world, we have two major types of flight training devices. We have a level 2 and a level 5. Level 2s are generic, very good, high technology, they're really impressive. I just wish we could use them for a lot more than we do. But there are limitations put on by the various regulatory agencies. On the other hand, the level 5 is a reproduction of a specific airplane. The only thing it doesn't do is move. It's a fixed based, literally it's equivalent to a full flight simulator in many, many ways. Wraparound visuals, to the point where I've seen people, when we would do demonstrations of our level 5s in Moncton, I've seen people standing behind the pilots hanging onto the seats. And although the simulator's not moving, they're actually sort of back and forth hanging onto the seat, and they would walk out of the simulator and saying, I just could have sworn we were moving. Yeah, right. That's what the visuals do. All right. That's how powerful that message is. So if we look at that 80 to 100 hours of actual flying, that was supplemented by about 300 plus hours in those very, very high-end FTDs. All right. The feedback we got after those, we ran two classes with CAE. The feedback we got at the end of those two classes was the people doing the check rides in Toronto on the A320 simulators were very impressed with the quality that these young men exhibited. Unfortunately, it was all young men at the time, but basically these young men exhibited. But here's the kicker. On a couple of occasions, they actually made the comment that a couple of these young men were actually performing at a recurrency level. In other words, this was their initial check ride, but yet they were so comfortable in the box flying the airplane for all intents and purposes that they were literally as if they'd been doing it for a while. All right. We also got feedback from people once these young men got flying for the airline. And in one particular case, I got direct feedback from one of the other instructors from CAE, who said he happened to be sitting in the jump seat on this one particular flight. The captain of the airplane did not know this young student had done the MPL program. All he knew, he was a relatively new first officer, been with the company, flying for maybe about 6 months to a year. After the flight was over, this instructor made a point of asking that captain, what do you think? How did you think he did? Oh, he said he did very, very well. Right? He says, how many hours or how long do you think he's been? Oh, he's been, 5-10 years he's been flying. No, right? He's just literally been on the airplane for half a year, maybe 500 hours total time. The reason for that is because there was a clear focus in the two elements, the focus of hands and feet and the focus of automation and flight management. And I think that's the mindset that we need to take forward. And unfortunately, here's what's happening. And this is why at least in my opinion, this is what I think is what's happening. Pilot training is very expensive, right? There's no getting around that. When I first started training, the ratio, if you will, if you were to go out and buy a brand new training airplane, like a little Cherokee 140 or a Cessna 172 at that time, you were paying about $30,000. Hard to believe in this day and age, but about $30,000 for out of the factory airplane. A private pilot license at that time was approximately $900 to $1,000. So you're looking at about a 1-to-30 ratio. All right. In today's world, we're looking at a 172 off the assembly floor. If you could put up with the year's wait, you're looking at $500,000 now, right? Well, if I'm a flying school, I got to pay for that. So guess who pays for it? It's the student learning how to fly. So the hourly rate now is in the $200 range, $300 range for a 172 in some cases. So all that to simply say that 1 in 30 ratio, guess what? Yeah, it's still there, but you do a 1 in 30 to $500,000, that's very, very expensive. All right. And in some ways, flight training is that sort of in a per dollar basis is actually cheaper today than it was 50 years ago. All right. So I guess maybe there's good news after all. However, it is still incredibly expensive for a young man or woman to go out and get their pilot's license today. So here's the thing. Operators are looking at every way they can to obviously keep the training within the prescribed hours of training, so the students obviously don't pay more than they really should. Well, the problem with, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's really good as far as the student is concerned. But what is being omitted, and to me, that's where the concern comes in, is because of the introduction of automation, the time that used to be spent on the hands and feet stuff is now being moved over into the automation. A more heavier reliance on the automation. So a lot of the basic hands and feet skills that used to be spent on, not done that way anymore, at least not as much as it was. So the end result is they have less, you might say, a lower comfort level when it comes to actually flying the airplane. So that's what worries me more than anything, because here's the thing, let's face it, pure economics, they're really going to be hard to increase the price, because already, students can't afford the training in many cases. We're slowly turning, back in the 40s and 50s, flying used to be a rich man's game. And unfortunately, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it became literally available for just about anybody. Now we're slowly moving back towards, you need to have lots of dollars to learn how to be a pilot. So how do we deal with that? I think what needs to be looked at is the funding support that these young women and young men and women could possibly get. If you look at a lot of the, you might say, scholastic funding or student loans, a lot of them are developed and built on a university style model. So the end result is it doesn't reflect the way flight training is done. So unfortunately, what happens is the monies that are given to students reflect a actually, in some cases, a significantly small portion of the total funds needed. All right.
Boy, that is like, amen. That is the truth. And if you are going to get your, go beyond your commercial license, that first portion, your private pilot's license, I mean, the options to finance that or to receive scholarships for that or any of the student aid funding, they're so limited for that first piece. And that's like the key piece. It's ridiculous.
You're absolutely right. And like, I know when I was at the flight college, we had a significant exercise that we completed where we finally won. Here's the problem is under the sort of the government structure, the funding was available for commercial pilot training, but there's no funding available for private pilot. They automatically assumed that if I signed up for like a commercial pilot, that I didn't have to do the private. I just did commercial pilot training. Well, no, that because of the way the licenses are structured, you got to have the private first, then you do the commercial, and on it goes. And they would not recognize, for example, for tax exempt purposes for students, the private pilot. And we finally won that battle. And what it took was for us to actually put together, obviously, that was one of the benefits of the integrated commercial pilot training, because now it was part of a curriculum that even though they did get a private license during the training, it was actually part of the big picture. So based on that, we were able to get student tax relief, if you will. But it still didn't help the funding part. All right. It was only the tax relief piece. So yeah, there's still some very, very significant questions to be asked and work to be done in figuring out ways to get support for young men and women so that they can actually get their licenses, because it's not that there's a lack of jobs out there. In this day and age, there's a pretty significant demand for young men and women to sort of, and here's the thing, if there's a professor, and I wish I remembered his name, but there's a professor from the University of Ottawa years ago that put together a paper that demonstrated sort of the ups and downs of the aviation world, no pun intended, over the years. And what he discovered is that aviation worked on approximately a 10-year cycle. And that from literally if you looked at a decade, from the year like the 0102 year right through to about 08, if you will, were the low years. That's when the industry tended to be very stagnant, not much growth. And then when 08, 09, and then 10 hit, went through the roof. And what he showed was about a 4-decade example. And sure enough, at the end of every decade, there was a very significant growth pattern. That hasn't changed. All right. We still go through roughly that same growth pattern. And there's usually something at the beginning of the decade that causes the industry to sort of go, uh-oh. You look at 9/11, that had a significant impact, right? So we still seem to be in that 10-year cycle, if you will. So theoretically, here we've got the COVID for this decade. So theoretically, what should happen next? We should have a very stagnant aviation industry. Well, this decade might be the decade that proves us wrong. That shows a significant shift, because all indicators are that once this COVID thing is over and behind us, things are going to pick up, and they're going to probably pick up really fast. And, as of today, certain airlines are making announcements saying we've had to cancel flights because we don't have sufficient flight crews. So we have that happening, and then we have the issue of, are we training enough pilots? All right, because it's, I know when I was at the flight college, we had no end to applications, but as soon as they sort of seen the cost of doing the train, whatever, there was a significant drop, you might say, in the amount of young men and women taking the course because they couldn't afford it. So you've got that. All right. The other thing too is unfortunately, I hate to say it, but a little bit of the romance of aviation has sort of started to shy away in many ways because of the automation. People are seeing it more as a, I don't know, glorified, button pusher. In some ways,
you have great friends in aviation.
I'm sorry?
I said, unless you have great friends in aviation, because one of the things I love about this world are the airplane people, right?
Oh, yeah.
They keep you in the game if you connect with the people around you, right?
Yeah.
And I think maybe that's something that's missing. I mean, that's the unfortunate part about moving sort of towards more of a university model compared to a club model, because you miss that people piece. Those are the people who are going to say, hey, I know you're having a bad day, let's go.
Yeah.
Right.
That's a very interesting point, because I know one of the things that I noticed when I left transport, when I was talking to the young men and women coming through the door to learn how to fly, one of the startling things for me was the amount of students. They were looking at this as another job. They didn't have that love for aviation. And I really felt bad for them. And the reason I say that is because I love the aviation industry. I mean, it's basically my life. Okay. I wouldn't trade it for the world, but it is an industry that tends to eat its young. All right. Unfortunately, it's a tough game. All right. You got to put your time in. If you're fortunate to get a job very quickly on, but you talk to pilots, a lot of pilots who've had to do a lot of different types of jobs. And while they're doing the job, they may not like it, but after the fact, you'll find them sort of reminiscing and saying, geez, that was actually a lot of fun. Right. So, but having said that, what I discovered was a lot of these young men and women coming through the system. Well, over the years, what I discovered as well is, because I've tried to stay in touch with some of them, the ones who stuck it out and the ones who are doing incredibly well today are the ones who had that love of aviation. I know when I started, I mean, everybody that I learned to fly with was absolutely bonkers about airplanes, right? We could tell you what the airplane was, the engine types. We could identify airplanes going overhead simply by the sound. We were just sort of psychotic, I guess. But basically, we were very keen on aviation. There's still that group out there, by the way. All right?
I know.
They're still out there.
Yes, I know.
But the thing is, yeah, exactly. But the thing is that there's a lot of other folks jumping in, and some of them will learn that love of aviation. All right. But unfortunately, there's certain ones. And unfortunately, although we might train 1,000 people a year, we're probably going to lose 100, 200, because all of a sudden they realize, boy, this is not what I had envisioned. This is not, what do you mean I don't fly I'm not a captain on a 747 after 12 months, right? No, that's not the way the system works, right? So all that to simply say that the numbers that we train are absolutely precious. All right. So we need to make sure that we figure out ways to cut down those barriers for those young men and women, so that the ones that are really keen can join in. All right. Because that's the other thing is, in many cases, they may be very, very keen, but they just simply can't afford it. Doesn't matter how many jobs they hold. It's pretty tough. All right. I mean, look at the training costs for someone today, for the full meal deal, if you will, commercial, multi-IFR, integrated ATPL, the whole thing. If you're not doing it in your hometown, if you've got to move somewhere else and you throw in, housing and meals and everything else, you're looking upwards of $100,000. All right. That's a significant investment for an 18, 19-year-old. All right. The first house I bought was only 29,000. And I was like, ugh. So, but still, in today's world, like, come on, $100,000. I can buy a couple of cars for that. Okay. Good cars. So it's expensive.
Yes, yes. I do want to ask you, actually, I appreciate this topic that we're on, and I could quite frankly talk about it all day long because I have my own opinion
Yeah, so could I.
about flight training. But I did want to ask, if you were a regulator today, what would you be watching for in our students or in our organizations? Or, you have the benefit of having the knowledge of what the regulatory sort of role is, and also your training. You've had a flight school, but also you're training all these private operators. If you were a regulator, what would you be watching for?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. What I would be literally watching company culture. All right, how they do things, why they do things. Here's why. More and more companies are learning the very valuable lesson that, for example, good safety and quality management systems within their organization, if they're done correctly, all right, can have a huge benefit to the company, morale, and the bottom line. All right. Every now and then I'll have the opportunity to talk to a CEO who implemented an SMS, let's say 5, 10, 15 years ago, and have been doing it ever since, and have been very good at implementing a good, solid program. And my sort of go-to question was, if transport told you today you didn't have to do this anymore, what would you do? And every one of them has said, I wouldn't change anything because this is a huge benefit to the company. All right. Okay. Well, that's the good news is more and more companies are starting to understand that lesson. Okay. Because here's the thing. If I was to go into an operator and I look at how they do things, I'm going to be looking at their level of intercommunications within the company. In other words, if I see something that I think could hurt the company, what's the response of the company going to be if I report it? Are they going to look at it and say, whoa, gee, thanks, we're going to look at that? And they're going to actually analyze it and take a look at it. And at the end of the day, they're going to make a decision based on what they found. And that decision could be, we're not changing anything because we've already got stuff in place that deals with that problem. And we think that is sufficient at this stage in time. We're going to keep an eye on it, but we don't have to do anything right now. Or they're going to basically say, oh, we need to do something. So they would implement some form of change, and they would ensure that that implementation is working. If I was to walk into a company and see that as sort of the way of doing business, all right, and I differentiate that from, well, that's our safety program. All right, this is actually the way they think. This is the way oh yeah, they've got a safety program.
Right, it's total integration.
Yeah, but right? it's so integrated that people don't, right? At the end of the day, what happens is I can go into that company and say, well, I don't have to see much more as a regulator. I can step back and be very comfortable that based on what I've seen, that these folks are actively looking for hazards. They're actively looking for any kind of quality escape, if you will. And they're also using these programs to implement a continuous improvement approach to the way they do business. At the end of the day, I can be pretty comfortable that if there is a non-compliance of some kind, they're going to find it. All right. They're going to see it. They're going to fix it. They're going to deal with it. It's not going to be an attitude to break the regulations. The attitude is whoops, how did that happen? We need to make sure it doesn't happen again. And I think that's what I would be looking for as a regulator, to see that they cross the I's and dot the T's and they've done this and they've done that. All that does is it tells me they've dotted the I's and crossed the T's. That's all. It really doesn't give me an insight of how they work day to day. All right. What makes them tick? And that's really what I would be looking for. And, you know, I guess to give you like a real world example, one of my proudest moments as running the flight college years ago was this is when we were actually working with CAE and getting an exemption to be an aviation training organization under the new regulations, which still have not been put out yet. But still, we got an exemption for it so that we could do these 2 trial MPL courses. So we were working very closely with transport, CAE, ourselves, and I mean, we had a clear focus on what we wanted to achieve. However, before we even got involved in that, I had been very adamant in establishing a solid, literally a safety culture. All right. And I remember the inspector who was doing the audit to approve us for this ATO exemption came into my office, and I had worked with him in the past, so I knew him. Anyway, he comes into my office and he says, Mike, he said, we got to talk. And he closes the door to my office. And having been a TC inspector, that's not a good thing. All right. When someone walks in like that and says, we need to talk, and they're halfway through an audit, what is going on? Right. And he sat down and he burst out laughing. And you could see the look on my face probably. And I said, okay, what's going on? He said, you're not going to believe this. Anyway, what had happened was he was asking people what they would do or how the SMS program worked. Okay. And he was asking some students and some instructors, and half of them didn't even know what an SMS was. Like they said, well, what are you talking? I don't know what you're talking about. So he went to see one of our senior people who was he says, how come these people don't even know what an SMS is, let alone explain? They should know how it works. He said, well, how are you asking the question? And he said, explain to me your SMS. He said, no, that's not the question. Ask them what they would do if they saw something that they felt was dangerous. Oh, so he went back and he asked them, and sure enough, they gave him literally great detail on how, well, if it's a hazard, this is how I report it. This goes to the safety officer who now does blah. And they literally took them through the process. All right. But they didn't know it was an SMS. Oh, that's just the way we do things.
Right.
That to me was one of my proudest moments as a CEO, because that told me that I think we're getting there. We're not there yet. All right. But we're slowly starting to get there. All right. Where people, this is no longer some program on a shelf. All right. Because, and I've seen that, unfortunately, companies go out and invest significant amounts of money to literally buy a program or a binder they stick on the shelf, and they say, well, we got a safety program. Yeah, but are you using it? Right? Is it paying for itself? Because if it's not paying for itself, you're wasting your money. All right. So the good news is I think more and more companies are starting to see that. So as a regulator, that's what I would be looking for. All right. I'll be looking for the company's culture, the company attitude, see how they do things.
What do you think the experience of a regulator today is compared to when you were a regulator?
I hate to say this, but on average, they're not happy. In talking to, let's put it this way, most of the guys that I worked with have all retired or unfortunately flown west, as we say. But I know for the few that are still there that I used to work with, that we've had a few heart-to-heart conversations, and unfortunately they see it that the role of the inspector has dramatically changed from what it used to be. And not that we would bend over backwards and do everything for the operator, but we were there that if the operator had a concern, they would pick up the phone. You know, when they submitted documentation for review, we would actually go through it and, you know, make sure that everything was done right. And if we discovered errors, you know, unfortunately, years ago, a decision was made that, you know, after the second or third mistake in a document, you just bundle it, send it back. You don't go through the whole thing, because that we don't have time to do that. Well, and what that ends up doing is it actually wastes more time, because the document, we start this ping pong exercise back and forth.
That's exactly right. Exactly right.
There are people out there who would take advantage of that. All right. So yeah, there's no question that, some people will say, well, we'll let transport, we'll just send in something and they'll fix it for us, whatever. No, trust me, I did enough of those manual reviews. You can tell the difference one from the other. Okay. There are some top operators who are honestly busting their behinds to try to get the job done right. And unfortunately, they've been penalized along with everybody else. And I don't find that speaks well for the efficiency. The other thing that I've heard from a lot of the inspectors that I continue to know and work with is a lot of them were complaining about the administrative burden of doing their job is at such a level that they really don't do much of the job anymore. It's a pendulum. I'll be honest with you. When I was an inspector back in the late 70s, early 80s, we didn't have much of an administrative burden because if anything, it was in some cases not really well done. All right. So it left a lot to be desired. I'll be the first one to admit that. But the difference is we were literally out every day working with operators, doing check rides, monitors, base inspections, audits of some kind, reviews, whatever. We spent very, very few days in the office. All right. We were on the road all the time. And we had, for example, in Atlantic Canada, we had 22 flying schools that we were responsible for. Myself and one more inspector. At one point, we actually had 3 inspectors, and we would basically take care of those 22 schools. Inspectors don't do that anymore. All right. And it's unfortunate. It's because of decisions being made at the much higher levels. And, it's not that I can understand why some of those decisions were made. All right. However, I think some of those decisions were made with a certain level of short-sightedness, in order to lower immediate costs. But what's the long-term impact? And I think what you're going to see, unfortunately, over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, unless there's a shift back to some of the old, not the old way, but some of the old ways of doing business, we're going to pay for it. All right. The industry is probably going to pay for it sooner or later, unless the industry as a whole really buys into good SMS and QMS protocols. That'll be the saving grace. All right. And if that happens, great. Well, I hope I'm proven wrong, but the pessimist in me, if you will, I'm very concerned about that we're going to see an increase. The potential is there to see a significant increase in accidents over the next 20 years because of the way things are being done today.
Right, right. I do have to say that all of my experience with Transport Canada has been positive, even when we were going through super rough times.
Yeah.
Everybody worked with me, and perhaps it's because, I work with lawyers, so I don't tolerate a lot of sass, but also I was willing to work with them. I wanted to, because I needed to, work our way through it. Right. So, I think that, I had the benefit of maybe newer inspectors with some of that old way of doing things where they didn't mind spending the time.
Well, I agree with you. The thing is, 20 years in, plus 20 years since I left, to this day, I still find that for the vast majority of activities that I have with transport, it's not the individuals. The individuals, literally to a person, will do whatever they can to do the job, but within the limitations that they're given. So having been there and seeing it from the outside, I still am a firm believer that if there's a problem with transport, it's not at the inspector level for the most part. I mean, you'll always get a few bad eggs, but for the vast majority of inspectors, they want to do their job. All right. When they get up in the morning, they want to make sure that, the job that they're tasked with is done properly. But they've been straddled with so many limitations and controls, paperwork, bureaucracy, that it's making it literally impossible for them to do their jobs. Right. And I went through this when I was there. There was a while when we did this, if I remember correctly, it was called an A-based review, where we had to literally record everything we did. All right. Because we had to prove our existence to the folks that control the purse strings. And it kind of backfired on them, because when they actually put their formulas to work, I know the department that I was running at the time, there was 3 of us in the department. When the A-based review was done, I had 3 more people join my staff, because they told us, you guys are so understaffed, it's unbelievable with the amount of work you're doing. Yeah, I've been telling you that all along, right?
Right.
So, but there's still, that mindset is still there. They have to prove, you have to literally prove your existence. And the end result is simple. You can see it. It's, you'll hear people stand up there and tell you all the good words about, client support, customer service and all this stuff. That's all well and good. But what I measure is behavior, not what comes out of people's mouth. What I measure is timelines. So when I look at a job, a certification, for example, that used to take 60 to maybe 90 days, and it's now taking upwards of 1.5 to 2 years, you're telling me the system is better? I don't think so. All right. When I look at young men and women getting medicals, 6 months after they show up for training, they still haven't received their, because this little piece of paper isn't whatever. And you can't pick up the phone anymore and call somebody and say, hey, because we used to do that, right? People would call us and say, hey, and we'd look up the file and say, oh yeah, we can fix that. Boom, done. 20 minutes, problem fixed, problem cured. Well, now, because of the types of controls and the automation and everything else, it makes it literally impossible for the inspectors, the support staff and so forth to actually do that. They have to follow the protocols. And all the protocols do is it slows the system down. Yeah, you might say, well, it adds a certain level of accuracy. Let's do a cost return on investment on that level of accuracy versus the amount of delays involved. All right. I think that's the next question that needs to be asked. But in a nutshell, the thing is there's still really, really good people at transport that are trying really hard to support the industry. But because of limitations of, funding, resources, and everything else, they just don't have the ability to do the job like the way they used to, as much as they would like to.
Right.
So
I do. Before we end our conversation, is there anything important that you feel is really important that I have forgotten to ask you?
No, I think we've covered quite a bit of territory.
Okay,
I can't think of anything to be out right out. I mean, there's all kinds of things, but
I know.
if we open that can of worms, we're going to be here for a while. So
yeah.
We'll just leave it at that for now.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I've really enjoyed our time together.
My pleasure.
I'm hoping that one day you'll come back and talk to me some more.
Yeah, I'd love to. Anytime. Let me know.
Excellent. Great.
If you find this video helpful, please hit the like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more conversations like this.